Welcome back to the autonomic nervous system. Today we'd like to understand the four terms I've written here. So we'd like to understand what does cholinergic mean, what does adrenergic mean, what does nicotinic mean, and what does muscarinic mean, and we want to fit those into our understanding of the basic anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. So far we've been looking at the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system at the level of single cells. In both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, you have a preganglionic neuron, which, inside of an autonomic ganglion, synapses on to a postganglionic neuron, and then the postganglionic neuron synapses onto a target tissue. Now, when information is traveling within a single cell down an axon, this is straightforward electrical conduction. So down the preganglionic axon and down the postganglionic axon, information is being carried through an action potential. But in order for the information to cross a synapse from one cell to the next, we're going to have to rely on chemical transmission. So we're going to have chemical or synaptic transmission occurring at two places along every single chain of two neurons in the autonomic nervous system. Number one, at the synapse that occurs between the pre- and postganglionic neurons within the ganglion, and number two, at the synapse between the postganglionic neuron and the target tissue. So today we'd like to get an overview of what are the actual transmitters that are used at these synapses, number one and number two, and also what receptors are used by the postsynaptic cell in both of the synapses. In other words, there are receptors here on the membrane of the postsynaptic cell and also on the target tissue that are responsible for transducing and receiving the information. Now, this information is incredibly important to understand because many of these receptors are very important drug targets. And all of the physiology that's going on at this synapse and this synapse in the parasympathetic nervous system and both of the synapses in the sympathetic nervous system are all rich with important drug targets. So one simplifying principle in understanding the physiology of the autonomic nervous system is that all of the synapses within the autonomic nervous system are either cholinergic or adrenergic. So let's start by describing a cholinergic synapse in the autonomic nervous system. So here we're looking at a synapse between a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. And let's say an action potential is traveling down the axon of the preganglionic neuron, which is going to ultimately depolarize this terminal portion of the presynaptic membrane. So this piece of the membrane is going to undergo a depolarization, and of course that part of the membrane that I've highlighted is loaded with voltage-gated calcium channels. So it's going to depolarize, which is going to cause the opening of calcium channels, which is going to cause an influx of calcium into this terminal end of the presynaptic axon. Now, already sitting at the end of the axon are little vesicles which are loaded with acetylcholine. And so they're just sitting there waiting for an influx of calcium, and when it arrives, these vesicles fuse with the membrane and dump their contents out into this space between the two neurons, which is called the synaptic cleft. So now there's going to be a surge of acetylcholine molecules in the synaptic cleft, and what they're going to do is they're going to act on receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. So any synapse where the transmitter release from the presynaptic terminal is acetylcholine, that's called a cholinergic synapse. So let's now take a look at which of the synapses in the autonomic nervous system are cholinergic. In other words, the transmitter release from the presynaptic side is acetylcholine, or ACH. So out of these four synapses, these two being part of the sympathetic nervous system, and these two being part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which of them are cholinergic synapses? Well, here's a simple rule. All synapses that occur within ganglia are cholinergic. Okay? So that means this synapse here, the first synapse in the sympathetic system, is going to be cholinergic, and so is this one here. So again, all synapses that occur in autonomic ganglia are cholinergic. In other words, the transmitter that's released from this neuron here is acetylcholine, and the same is true in the sympathetic system. Now, it also turns out that the second synapse in the parasympathetic nervous system is also cholinergic. In other words, the postganglionic neuron actually releases acetylcholine onto the target tissue at parasympathetic effector sites. So hopefully this is pretty straightforward. In the parasympathetic nervous system, it's pretty easy to remember that both the synapse between pre- and post-ganglionic neurons is cholinergic, as is the synapse between the postganglionic neuron and the target tissue, like for example the heart or the gut. So when the parasympathetic nervous system, let's say to the heart, is activated, you'll have acetylcholine released in a ganglion from the preganglionic neuron onto the membrane of the postganglionic neuron, and then the postganglionic neuron will directly release acetylcholine onto cardiac tissue. On the other hand, let's say the sympathetic nervous system wants to activate the heart. The first thing that happens is that the first synapse between the pre- and postganglionic neurons, that first neuron actually releases the same acetylcholine onto the second neuron, or the postsynaptic neuron. But the second synapse in the sympathetic nervous system is typically adrenergic. In other words, the neurotransmitter released from the postsynaptic neuron onto the target tissue is norepinephrine, or noradrenaline. So let's recap. At the top I've drawn a schematic of the sympathetic nervous system, and you could actually tell that because the axon of the first neuron that I've drawn is relatively short, and that's the overall trend of the sympathetic nervous system. And at the bottom I've drawn a schematic of the parasympathetic nervous system with a very long preganglionic axon and a second neuron whose axon is quite short. Now let's figure out which synapses are cholinergic. This is easy to figure out because in the parasympathetic nervous system, the answer is both the first and the second synapses are cholinergic. Our other principle is that any synapse occurring within an autonomic ganglion is cholinergic, which makes this first synapse in the sympathetic nervous system also cholinergic. So, when there's lots of sympathetic activation going on at the ganglion between the first and second neuron, there's lots of acetylcholine being released into the synaptic cleft between the first and second neurons. However, the postganglionic sympathetic neuron releases norepinephrine onto target tissues. So, therefore, we refer to this synapse as adrenergic. Adrenergic. Now, it turns out that there are a couple of rare exceptions to this rule where the postganglionic sympathetic axon does release acetylcholine, but that is rare, and that only occurs where the postganglionic sympathetic neuron is synapsing onto a sweat gland. So keep that in the back of your mind, that the second synapse of the sympathetic system is, for the vast majority of times, an adrenergic synapse, but when it's occurring at a sweat gland, the postganglionic sympathetic axon is actually releasing acetylcholine, in which case we would refer to that as a choline, acetylcholinergic synapse. So now we understand which synapses in the autonomic nervous system are adrenergic, and those are the ones I've circled in red, versus which ones tend to be adrenergic, which I've highlighted in blue, versus cholinergic, which I've highlighted in red. Now we need to address the issue of nicotinic versus muscarinic. So let's say we're looking at two cholinergic synapses here, and all that cholinergic means is that the presynaptic neuron releases acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. However, not all cholinergic synapses work the same way. Now, the major thing that can vary across two cholinergic synapses is the type of receptors that the postsynaptic neuron uses to receive the acetylcholine signal. So the broadest term that you could use to describe a receptor for acetylcholine is just a cholinereceptor. But as you know, there are two main types of receptors for acetylcholine, or cholinereceptors, and those are nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. So I hope this is clear that both of these synapses, number 1 and number 2, right? Both of these synapses are cholinergic synapses, and that's just because the presynaptic neuron is releasing acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft. However, the postsynaptic membrane is completely different, because up here you have muscarinic receptors, and down here you have nicotinic receptors. Now, nicotinic receptors have the ability to bind acetylcholine, and so do muscarinic receptors. They're both receptors for acetylcholine, or cholinereceptors. But that's basically their only similarity, because when nicotinic receptors bind acetylcholine, nicotinic receptors themselves are actually ion channels. And so when they bind acetylcholine, their ion channel opens, and you actually get a depolarizing current into the membrane of the postsynaptic cell, like so. So the net effect of this release of acetylcholine was a current and a depolarization of this postsynaptic membrane. And because when you activate a nicotinic receptor, you get a flux of ions through the membrane, you could call nicotinic receptors ionotropic receptors. So that's a more general term, which just means a receptor that's also an ion channel. Now, what happens when the muscarinic receptor is activated by acetylcholine? So remember, these are both cholinergic synapses, so it's the same exact wave of acetylcholine, but the downstream events, if there are muscarinic receptors being activated, is completely different from if there are nicotinic receptors being activated. Now, why is that? That's simply because the muscarinic receptor is not an ion channel. It's actually a G protein coupled receptor. And of course, when you activate a G protein coupled receptor, you're going to activate a whole cascade of metabolic changes within the postsynaptic cell, which is completely different from the electrical current that you activated when you stimulated the nicotinic receptors. So let's zoom out for a second and do a little bit of classification of autonomic nervous system synapses. So all the synapses in the autonomic nervous system can be divided into those that are cholinergic versus those that are adrenergic. And we talked about this earlier because it turns out that both synapses in the parasympathetic nervous system are cholinergic, whereas only the first synapse in the sympathetic nervous system is cholinergic, and then the second synapse in the sympathetic nervous system is adrenergic. So what I want to emphasize is that these terms only address the neurotransmitter that is released from the presynaptic side. And if it's ACH, then we call it a cholinergic synapse, and if it's norepinephrine or noradrenaline, we call it an adrenergic synapse. Now, we can subclassify all of the cholinergic synapses based on the receptors that are present on the postsynaptic membrane. If there are nicotinic or ionotropic receptors present, then we could call it a cholinergic but also a nicotinic synapse. And if on the postsynaptic membrane there are muscarinic receptors, then we would also still call it a cholinergic synapse, but we would also have to specify that it's a muscarinic synapse. And remember that nicotinic receptors are ionotropic receptors. In other words, when you activate them, you actually get an electrical current in the postsynaptic cell, whereas muscarinic receptors are metabotropic receptors. They're G-protein coupled metabotropic receptors. They're G-protein coupled receptors that actually cause a bunch of metabolic changes in the postsynaptic cell. So I hope you can see why, if someone tells you a synapse is cholinergic, it would be very important to find out whether that cholinergic synapse is nicotinic or muscarinic, because there's a fundamental physiology is very different between nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. So let's finish up this video by understanding which synapses in the autonomic nervous system are cholinergic and which are adrenergic. This is easy to remember because both of the synapses in the parasympathetic nervous system are cholinergic. Another principle we remember is that all synapses that occur within ganglia are cholinergic. Remember that cholinergic just means that the presynaptic neurotransmitter that it's released is acetylcholine. Okay, but what that doesn't specify is the receptor that's present on the postsynaptic membrane, which is really the ultimate determinant of what that acetylcholine signal is going to mean to the postsynaptic cell. So now we can talk about, at these cholinergic synapses, what are the receptors that are present? Well, it turns out that all of the synapses that occur in ganglia use nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. So this acetylcholine that's released in a ganglia is going to end up working on a nicotinic receptor on the membrane of the postganglionic neuron. And the same is true in sympathetic ganglia, that this acetylcholine that's released is going to end up acting on nicotinic receptors on the membrane of neuron number 2. So it shouldn't be surprising that in the parasympathetic nervous system, this acetylcholine that's released from postsynaptic parasympathetic neurons onto target tissues, like let's say the heart, is going to end up acting on muscarinic receptors, which is fundamental to the physiology of the parasympathetic nervous system. And recall that the second synapse in the sympathetic system is actually adrenergic, so what's being released from the presynaptic side is actually norepinephrine. So of course, sympathetic target tissues, okay, are going to have a completely different type of receptor, and those, of course, are sensitive to norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and so those are called adrenoreceptors. So this norepinephrine here that's released onto target tissues from the postganglionic neuron is going to act on adrenoreceptors, which fall into 4 main classes, and these are the famous alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, and beta 2 adrenergic receptors. These are all G-protein coupled receptors, but they all have different tissue distributions. So, for example, the heart is famously rich in beta 1 adrenergic receptors. So we learned today which synapses in the autonomic nervous system are cholinergic, and which synapses in the autonomic nervous system are adrenergic. Not only that, we also learned the distribution within the cholinergic synapses of nicotinic receptors versus muscarinic receptors, and of course, adrenergic synapses must have adrenergic receptors which are located on the membranes of the target tissues. So hopefully now it should be easier to understand why the autonomic nervous system can have such diverse effects on different target tissues by the differential expression of different cholinergic and adrenergic receptors throughout different target tissues.